which is, it's nice to believe. It's a very hopeful message. It's nice to believe that no one starts off in life with anything other than, equal potentiality, right? And that it's only, the nefarious forces of our environment and socialization and so on that take us down the life trajectories that we go down. That's a nice message. So anybody can be Lionel Messi, anybody can be Einstein, anybody could be Michael Jordan. So I think a lot of the nonsense that's been spewed in the social sciences over the past 100 years is not because most social scientists are walking degenerates who don't understand anything about life. I think it comes from a good place, right? So, for example, the cultural relativists you mentioned earlier, cultural and moral relativism. So that started with Franz Boas, the cultural anthropologist, who sort of was aware that having a biological explanation for things could have a downstream effect that's bad, right? And we know all the different reasons for that, right? And therefore, let's create a worldview that, while completely incorrect, is at least more hopeful. And that, to me, is an affront to the truth, and therefore I will attack it.
Again, I'm a little torn on some of these issues because I do see some of them as just not being a direction worth going. I mean, actually, it's interesting that because this is really not my bent at all intellectually. I just tend to go where the facts lead. But I'm sympathetic with the idea that certain types of research, certain facts, which can be as factual as any other, can be so reliably misunderstood or misappropriated that it's, on some level, knowledge not worth having. There's nothing to do about it necessarily, or if there is, that's not obvious, and the result could be reasonably expected to be bad or unproductive for society. And so I still think that the search for racial difference in specific areas like intelligence or, let's say, aggression, there's no doubt they exist. I mean, it would be a miracle if populations that show significant phenotypic differences by dint of their distinct evolutionary paths showed exactly the same level of traits for every trait we value. I mean, there's just no way that's true, right? So if we could really get down in a fine-grained way to the details here and scale all these different populations on intelligence and empathy and aggression and everything else that is psychologically interesting to us, what then, right? And this does come back to what you said about a misunderstanding of just what it means for something to be genetically determined or to have its basis in biology. Because obviously, as you said, ideas modify the regulation of our genes. Experience does. The brain is not a closed system. The brain is in dialogue with the world. So the boundary between nature and nurture is not hard and fast. And if you look closely enough, it really doesn't exist. So when you're talking about the ways that are left open to you to use this knowledge, you're not talking about changing the genomes of people to improve them. At least you're not talking about that yet. And also, there's a misunderstanding that creeps in that the variance is likely to be significant enough that it would be rational to judge someone based on the population they come from. Let's say it's just a fact that Koreans are, on average, better at math than white Americans. I'm just making this up, but let's say something like that's true.
Sure.
And you introduce me to a random Korean and a random Caucasian. It would not be rational for me to think I knew anything about their mathematical ability based on their racial characteristics. But no one's going to follow that, really. And people are just going to make these blanket judgments about populations based on the facts we find.
Many of you might recognize that excerpt. It's from a recent podcast that Sam Harris did with Gad Saad. And Gad Saad has uploaded his own version of that on his channel. And I even saw some of my own subscribers leaving comments there. And there's a lot of ground to cover. Arguably, it was the most interesting, although perhaps interesting isn't the right word, the most compelling podcast or talk Sam Harris has done. He's had more interesting podcasts, related to cosmology or what have you. But as far as compelling topics are concerned, this one was it. And there was a lot said, and this was just an excerpt. And I'm not trying to quote mine here, but they spent a significant amount of time talking about research into forbidden areas and no-go zones in science, in addition to Islam. I'm not going to cover too much about the Islam aspect of the talk. In fact, I'm primarily going to be talking about forbidden knowledge and Sam Harris's own attitudes and how they've changed, or perhaps more precisely, how they have not changed. So it was a really interesting talk. I strongly suggest you listen to the entirety of the discussion they had, not least of which because it would give you more context for what I'm about to talk about. So before I answer the question, what good is it, and I think this is the main question here, what good is it to study human differences in human biodiversity, sex differences, genetic population differences, racial differences in a more political tone? I want to talk about the issue of Sam Harris himself. And I think it's a really interesting thing that Sam Harris, I'd say within the past year, has been confronted with, which is the failure of multiculturalism, the failure of pluralism, the failure of liberalism, as it had been conceived since Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society. So the past 50 years have proven to many people, including myself, to have been a failure. All this nonsense about diversity and multiculturalism, affirmative action, all these things. And while Sam Harris himself has not really changed his positions here, he's being confronted with a really ugly reality, which is to say these so-called liberals that are traditionally or have traditionally been on his side have been rallying against him and putting him up against the wall and just criticizing him and saying, look, you can't say that, you're an Islamophobe, and God forbid you talk about anything related to genetic differences in populations. And I think we're slowly but surely seeing Sam Harris's facade here crumble. He's confused. And above all, he's sitting on the fence. Now, a little bit of background regarding Sam Harris and myself, as if you knew I existed. No, he doesn't. But the thing is, I started reading him years ago, end of 2004, so I've known him for probably about 12 years. Read the End of Faith, read most of his books, in fact, and not all of them. The meditation one I didn't finish, just because laziness or whatever. And so I'm familiar with his thought, and sometimes he can be exasperating, his gynocentrism, some other things as well. I mean, it's hard for him to do a podcast without talking about some poor girl somewhere in the third world having battery acid thrown in her face, or, veiled women, or, girls and women's this. And he's very gynocentric. That's one flaw of his, I think. But I think his major flaw is just buying into a lot of liberal fluff. And of course, when I first had discovered Sam Harris in the days of yore, I was in my late 20s, and I was still very much a libertarian, general capital L libertarian, kind of the Ron Paul type, more or less. I was very enamored of the whole ideology. And this is a long time ago, and one transformation I've noticed in myself, and indeed in a lot of other people, is as we've been confronted with the reality around us, observing changes on the ground in Europe, following the politics, the consequences of certain policies, we've been forcibly divorced from our former libertarian values, which is to say, I haven't been a libertarian, capital L, in years. And I'm probably not even a small L libertarian anymore. I'm sympathetic with a lot of the stuff, but maybe lower taxes, smaller government, that kind of thing. But generally speaking, I just take each issue on its own. And it's interesting that the common man has undergone, I being part of the common man, or the common group of people who have changed their views. We've changed our views on these, but Sam Harris has not. And I think what's really interesting here is the fact that there are pressing reasons why he's not. Now, he is fence-sitting, he is virtue signaling throughout this video, as your podcast, as you listen to it, but I think he's trapped between a rock and a hard place. He's terrified of the idea of being called something really bad, a racist, Islamophobe, whatever. He's already been called that probably, but he's trying to be reasonable. But the reality is, given the trajectory of the so-called culture wars, if you want to call it that, you can't be reasonable, not in that sense. You can't appease the enemy, and you can't appease all sides. You're going to have to take some flack. You're going to have to be called all kinds of things. I've been called everything. Racist, anti-Semite, misogynist. That's probably the one I've been heard the most. Whatever. Illiberal, blah, blah, blah. Communist, Marxist, everything you can imagine, every political polarity, every negative, whatever. I've been called that. And I think you're just going to have to, if you want to make progress in any of this discourse, you're going to have to, as an individual, whether you're famous like Sam Harris or not, such as myself, you're going to just have to bear the brunt of that and just deal with it. And I don't think he's come to that revelation quite yet, and I think he needs to come to that revelation. Gad Saad, overall, did a much better job during this discussion than Sam Harris did. Sam Harris was, like I said, sitting on the fence, virtue signaling. Gad Saad, as you heard in the snippet there, if it's not true, I don't want to deal with it. Or rather, I'm not going to support it if it's not true. He mentioned Franz Boas, who I guess you call him the progenitor of this whole, everything is culture, society, blah, blah, blah nonsense. And probably had good intentions behind that. But Sam Harris is going to have to pivot to a position at some point in time where he acknowledges that the liberal experiment of diversity and multiculturalism and we all get along and tra-la-la-la, all that bullshit, manifestly in the actual world doesn't work very well. It might work in a circle of academics, intellectuals. He probably is a millionaire by now. Those circles, yeah. So you get a lot of this multiculturalism, whatever. And I think this is one of the fallacies a lot of these highfalutin liberals commit, is that they're preaching to the choir, number one, and they're also preaching down from a pulpit that's very much elevated, metaphorically speaking, from the ground. They tend to be very wealthy, very comfortable, and they don't see what's going around them. I mean, because their neighborhoods aren't filled with this sort of thing that we observe as a result of diversity and multiculturalism. So I'm hoping that at some point in time, Sam Harris will confront this head on and say, look, I don't care what you call me. We need to call a spade a spade. He claims to be motivated by the truth. He claims to be motivated by facts. More power to him. But the meat of the argument here, I guess, to be made is, why bother studying human biodiversity? I mean, of course, there are obvious reasons, and ones he would endorse, improvement of medical conditions, congenital and fatal diseases, for example. If we study genetics, we can figure that out. But I'm going to list a few reasons as to why it is important to do this. I mean, Gad Saad himself throughout the talk said, look, if it's interesting, study it. That's generally my point of view as well. But one thing that we can immediately get from studying human biodiversity and the differences between people is, and he's saying, what do you do with it, is what we shouldn't be doing. I think that's the first thing we can derive from our understanding of human biodiversity, sex differences, what have you. For years now, we've had this infernal system of welfare and affirmative action in academia and in business and jobs. And if we understand human biodiversity, we understand that much of the results of what we're seeing in the world are a reflection of, yes, obviously interaction with the environment, but the fact that certain genetic populations are, on average, on aggregate, smarter and more intelligent and more capable than others. Just as others are more athletic, faster, stronger, etc. I pointed this out before. I mean, I've said this a million times, but no one I know of is railing against the fact that the NBA, right, the National Basketball Association in the United States, is composed of 75% of people of African American stock, or probably some mixture of majority sub-Saharan African and European stock. Nobody's complaining about it. No one's railing against it. No one's saying we need affirmative action here. It's only when it comes to other areas that we have this. And, if we don't see a preponderance, say, of black people in the hard sciences, or women for that matter, because it's a related issue, there are probably some really good reasons for that. And the reasons for that, I think, on aggregate, Black people have lower IQs on average. They're not as intelligent. And whilst it's not necessarily the case for women, it's that women's inclinations are just such that they don't go into these fields. And yet, we were elevating people who either are not inclined to go into these things, have no interest, and thus, as a consequence of disinterest, probably aren't motivated to do a good job, and people that are just not fit for the qualifications that they allegedly are supposed to fulfill. So affirmative action, all of this stuff, and I'm just giving you one example, of course, this is something that could be done away with. There would be good reason to believe that it's a waste of time. I mean, I think most people, and I guess there are some exceptions, would agree that, generally speaking, if there's a certain occupation or a certain job, you want the best person for it, independent of race, sex, whatever. And the consequence of that is that given a certain group's predilections and their strengths and weaknesses, genetic group, you will see on aggregate certain tendencies. And the marketplace, as it were, will reflect that. It's why the NBA is dominated by black people. Why the NFL is more of a mixture, depending on the position, etc. Why the sciences tend to be dominated by Caucasians and Asians, specifically East Asians. No surprise here. And we would save ourselves money and resources and time not endorsing things like affirmative action, and which are a waste of time. We don't need to elevate people that are, frankly speaking, unfit. And by that, I don't mean specific races, but individuals who belong to groups who then also fall within that average. I'm not talking about people far to the right of a bell curve in this case, which one would assume, given such abilities, if they are far to the right of the bell curve of their group's average, they would excel and be able to merit things on their own. So that's one thing you immediately get rid of. We don't need affirmative action. We don't need welfare because clearly, given trends, our understanding of human biodiversity, it's not necessary. And the irony here is this has been argued long before we understood anything about group population genetics and the dynamics of group population genetics. So it's strange, but this would certainly buttress that and drive home the point that, look, that we don't need to invest in this. But that's what we shouldn't be doing. Now, I do share some concerns with Sam Harris, and this is the reason why I think we need to defeat political correctness. Defeat political correctness. What does that mean? Be able to get some of this stuff out into the mainstream. Why? Well, because we really want to make sure, if we are going to design policies based on facts and information related to human biodiversity, we really want to make sure that the stuff we have on hand, the facts, the knowledge, that is airtight. We want airtight knowledge because we don't want to go on suppositions. We don't want to design policies on even on probabilities. We want to know things in depth. But the only way to get there, of course, is to study these things in depth. And we're in an atmosphere, in an environment as a people, as a common person, but especially above all, as Gad Saad has pointed out, where you cannot study these things. That's especially true of sex differences, public discussion of sex differences, what motivates men and women, and even more true, I would argue, of so-called racial differences or genetic differences between populations and the implications of that. Now, where would this go long term? Well, he mentioned improving people's genomes. I think we need to do that. And there are prescient reasons for this. My general impression of humanity is that we're doomed. I think we've evolved our technology way past our point of our own ability to adapt to it on a physiological level, and by that I mean the mechanization effect, everything that's come to pass in the past 50 years. And we're just woefully ignorant of how a new environment, new technologies, new resource availability affects us, and how we just instinctively react to that as animals who in the past had to live in an environment of scarcity and difficulty and hardship. And we're failing at this. And I think, we're at the terminus in a lot of ways of this whole liberalism is good, diversity is good. And I'll have a lot more to say about that in relation to evolution in the future. But it strikes me as necessary now. We're going to have to modify ourselves. We're going to have to genetically modify ourselves as a very first step. We will have to surpass our human limitations by becoming something inhuman, perhaps, superhuman, more than human, however you want to term it. We will have to modify ourselves if we want to continue as a species. To achieve escape velocity, to survive the trials and tribulations of the future, what we have now, it's not flawed in a traditional sense. From an evolutionary perspective, everything is fine. But our nature, in as much as it interacts with the current environment, is deeply flawed because it's not in tune with that. We're going to have to modify ourselves in order to do that. And in order to do that, we will have to study human biodiversity, because it's only by observing and understanding, what makes people tick. What are the alleles in a certain population that are very common that makes that population, say, intelligent or fast or resistant to heart disease or have greater longevity or whatever, resist arthritis. I mean, there are probably thousands of possible allele combinations you could study. All of this ideally should be studied because we want to exceed ourselves and our limitations. And I think this is my own humble opinion as a nobody, as a dumb, unremarkable nobody, but we need to do this in order to progress as a species. Everyone is tearing away at the world, trying to grab a piece of the pie. Some people are injecting a revival of religion. Other people are injecting the idea of a revival of tribalism, nation states, racial all this stuff. Yeah, I mean, this is the primeval cycle of destruction. This is not going to move us forward. We're not going to move forward by trying to pick up pieces of the past. If anything, it's going to be a modification of the destruction we're already experiencing via diversity. It'll be some other destructive element. We really need to exceed ourselves. We need to become more than human, because humans are just not good enough. We are not good enough as a species to continue on this planet and do the things we're doing. We're too stupid. We're too driven by instinct. Our physiologies are not in tune with our environment, the availability of food. We're just beholden to a set of instincts that served us really well for countless millennia, tens of millennia. But we're at a stage now where that absolutely must be overcome if we want to progress as a species. All these problems that we're experiencing now, people are just taking whacks at it. So the guest I had on not too long ago, he's all about Catholicism. Resurrect the Catholic Church as an authority. That'll fix it all, right? Other people from the alt-right, we need, racial white nationalism. Then the diversity core, we need more diversity. Everyone is saying we need to do this, and this has been tried over and over and over. But we're finally at the cusp of discovery here, of modifying our genes. I suspect in the next 20 years this will become an actual thing. We'll start with medical augmentations or medical modifications, and it'll move on from there. And we can't do that if we don't study human population differences. There's no shame in belonging to one of these populations that on aggregate appears not to be very good at one thing but good at another. That's true across the board for every genetic population. But ultimately, I think that's what we should be striving for. None of this rehashing of the past. And I'll have a lot more to say about the specifics and the science of genetic modification in future videos, if I'm still alive, that is. But what I want to say here is that the most pressing reason to study this is because we cannot continue as we are now. It's not that evolution has halted. It's just that we don't evolve quickly enough to adapt to this ever-changing environment. And we desperately need to change ourselves. We need to be better than, frankly speaking, the pathetic apes that we are. So anyway, That is my view as to why we need to proceed forward. But I hope Sam Harris finally moves away from his fence sitting and virtue signaling and realizes, hey, we have a big uphill battle, and the battle involves improving humanity and moving past our limitations, and we can't do that if we countenance this nonsense from liberals, or for that matter, rehashing the past. The Catholic Church rules the world 2.0 or whatever. I severely doubt that would be beneficial long term to humanity or any other version of this rehashing. So, everyone, thanks for tuning in. More videos to come, assuming I'm alive. You enjoy the rest of your week, and bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.